Before we leave chapter 6, I want us to take another look at this last horse, the green horse, and the rider on the green horse. Now, the fourth horseman is described in the New American Standard Bible, which is the translation that I'm using for our scriptural references here. It describes the fourth horse as being ashen in color. Other translations that you'll see will refer to it as being pale or livid or pale green or some other variation of that. But the translation here technically is just green. The Greek word is chloros. It's the same word that we get the words chlorophyll and chlorine from, and it simply means green. It doesn't mean ashen, it doesn't mean pale, it doesn't mean livid, it doesn't even mean pale green. It simply means green. And every other time that we see that word chloros translated in the Bible, it's translated simply as green, as in like the green grass, for example. Now you can imagine that the translators of the Bible, those that are taking the original Greek and putting it into English, had trouble imagining or visualizing a green horse. That's not something you see every day, right? You can understand a red horse or a white horse or a black horse, but who's ever seen a green horse? That really would be a horse of a different color, wouldn't it? So instead of calling it a green horse, which is what a literal translation of that word would demand, they took a little bit of liberty here and translated pale or ashen or some variation. Now, green also happens to be a color that's closely associated with Islam. Now, I don't want to read too much into this. I just want to give it out to you as a reference. We see it particularly relating to Islamic martyrs. We see this color green. In fact, when Jerusalem was retaken by the Israelis in 1967, they had to go through a green door that was protecting the Temple Mount. Now, you could actually go online and hear some of the radio broadcasts that were going on over the, over their wireless radios back during those days in 1967. So we see green on what we know as the Temple Mount. We see it very prominently as a color that's on the mount today. Also, green flags are used in Islamic countries to designate the graves of the martyrs. I know when I was in Afghanistan, that I was riding around with my translator, and I saw these green flags out over these cemeteries, and I asked the translator, what do these green flags represent? And he says, those are the martyrs, those that had been killed in some type of jihad, some type of a holy war. Now, if you go up on the Temple Mount today, I took these pictures on my last trip to Israel, you'll see a lot of things colored green. I mean, that's just a correlation I like to make here, or an observation I like to make. For this fountain here on the left, that is right outside of the Dome of the Rock, and it's painted green. You see this door. There's lots of green doors that are there. The rider on the green horse is identified to us. He's actually personified as death, and he's being followed by Hades. Now, we're going to get into a really great discussion about death and Hades and Sheol and Tartarus and all that and what that really means when we get into Revelation chapter 20 at the Great White Throne Judgment, and when we see the unregenerate are resurrected in the second resurrection. We'll spend some more time dealing with that, but I just want to call your attention to this now, that the rider of the green horse and Hades are given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beast of the earth. Isn't that interesting? A fourth of the earth they're given power over. Now, I pulled this up doing some research for this study, and the most recent statistics I could get was from 2015, but it shows that Islam is practiced by about 24% of the world's population. That's an estimate, obviously, but that's really, really close to 25%, isn't it? So a fourth of the world's population consider themselves to be Muslim. And the weapon of choice amongst the radical Islamists, those that have been radicalized, the terrorists, is in fact the sword. This is their preferred method of killing what they might refer to as infidels, and certainly with Christians. In fact, the U.S. Marines are called leathernecks to this day because of what happened in the early 1800s when Thomas Jefferson sent the U.S. Marines to the Barbary Coast, the northern coast of Africa, to fight against the Barbary pirates that were raiding American ships and disturbing American European trade interest. They were sent there to fight against the Barbary pirates, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. That was a northern Africa, Barbary coast area. And the Marines would actually wrap their necks with leather to prevent themselves from being beheaded by the scimitars of the Barbary pirates, and so that's how they get their nickname Leathernecks to this day. We know that, and oftentimes in Islamic rulership, particularly in the third world types of countries where they don't have the petrodollars to finance their infrastructure, that those countries are often plagued by famine and pestilence because of for various reasons, the economic depression that is there, as well as the lack of some of the sanitary practices and such as that, lack of medical care and whatnot. But when it talks about giving authority to kill a fourth of the population, including the wild beast of the earth, now when we think about that word, we think about some lion coming down out of the jungle and snatching somebody and killing them, and it could mean that. But the most dangerous of the wild beasts are the ones you can't see, the microscopic organisms, and we certainly know that in light of recent events. So these are the ones, and they often go along with famine. When we see a lot of famine, we'll see pestilence, we'll see disease, these microscopic organisms. I throw that out there for your consideration. But let's just go on. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, and I saw underneath the altar, this is very important, underneath the altar, the souls of those who had been slain. Remember, the fourth horseman is death. Those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood and those who dwell on the earth, our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Now, we've got this vision here of Christian martyrs that are under the altar in the throne room of God in the heavenly temple, and they're crying out for vengeance. And this is at the fifth seal. Keep this in mind. This becomes very important as we continue our study. And they want their blood avenged on those who dwell on the earth. And we'll talk a little bit later on about the earth dwellers. That term comes up quite a bit in our Revelation study, and I think we'll see that that's not referring to Christians, because even though we might be living currently on the earth, this is not our dwelling. Our dwelling is our heavenly home. We're just this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. We're here sojourning for a time. So let's go on. And there was given to each of the martyrs, a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. So there's more of them to be killed. There's more martyrdom to take place in this time period, in this final 7 years, wherever we are in this 7 years. At this point, the 70th week of Daniel, there's already been some that have been killed. Obviously, there's been many martyrs that have been killed in years past, and they're crying out for vengeance, and there's more to come. So there's more Christians yet to be killed as this final 7-year period, the 70th week of Daniel, continues to unfold. Notice that there's no destruction associated with the fifth seal. There was with the first four, but there's not with the fifth seal, for whatever significance that might be. And we're going to see when we get to Revelation 18 where God begins to take out his vengeance on the city of Babylon. And we'll get into a discussion about who and what Babylon is. Is it the ancient Babylon that still exists today in some degree over in modern-day Iraq, about 50 miles or so south of Baghdad? Or is it figurative for some other city or some other place? Many people have speculated it might be the United States, it might be Europe. We'll get into all that when we get to Revelation 18. But we see that when God does exact his vengeance on Babylon the Great, he is avenging the blood of his saints, the martyrs. And we can see that in this quick passage. We'll do a fast forward here to Revelation 18. Rejoice over her, contextually Babylon. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. So Babylon, at least here, is being referred to and associated with these martyrs. So going on to verse 12. I looked when he broke the sixth seal, And there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as cloth, sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. Now, we've seen this description pop up a number of different places in Scripture of the sun becoming darkened and the moon becoming like blood. We see it in Joel chapter 2, for example. Joel was the first of the Old Testament prophets to really begin to talk about the day of the Lord, and he identifies that very early in the book of Joel. And then later prophets would often just refer to it as that day. Joel had kind of established what day we're talking about here. We're talking about the day of Jesus' return, the day of vengeance that Jesus said had not yet been fulfilled from that Isaiah 63 passage. The day of vengeance of the Lord hasn't come yet. Jesus came the first time. The second time is the day of the Lord, the coming vengeance. And this is what Joel says will take place. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So before, and probably very close to before, maybe just before, we're going to see this cosmic upheaval take place just prior to Jesus' return. That's why this whole thing about the blood moons, I understand the prophetic implications of that many people are trying to draw, but I don't really think that's what we're talking about here, because unless Jesus happens to come back right after one of them, because they seem to be closely linked in time to Jesus' return. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree cast its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. So we've got this illustration of the stars falling from the sky. Now we know that there's going to be this cosmic upheaval just prior to his return and the rapture of the church. We've already looked at these passages out of the Olivet Discourse. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, immediately after, not just some time after, not just some time in the future, not some undeterminate period of time, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the Great Tribulation, the last 3.5 years of that 70th week of Daniel, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. Look, it's a very close parallel here. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, that term is very interesting because in the Greek, the Greek translation is dynamis Uranus, and I might be mispronouncing that, but hopefully there's not too many ancient Greek scholars in the audience that can correct me on that. But it means the powers of the heaven, and that word dynamis in the Greek is the root word for our English word dynamite, and also for dynamo, and it literally means power. And Uranus is the root for not only the planet by that name, but it's also the root for the element uranium. Interesting. A radioactive element associated with that word Uranus. And so could Jesus literally here be referring to a dynamite of uranium? Some type of a nuclear catastrophe? I don't know. It's speculative, but it does invite some contemplation here, doesn't it? It does invite us to get to consider this and to maybe scrutinize it in more detail. And then he goes on in verse 14. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. It does sound a lot like nuclear warfare, doesn't it? I mean, it really does. We think about the sky rolling up, like you know how you see the smoke from a nuclear explosion. Look at this parallel verse from Isaiah, and all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. That's really interesting. The fact that the sky is rolled up has implications that there's some type of multidimensionality at work here. In other words, for something to be rolled up, there must be another dimension for it to be rolled up in. Let me give you an imperfect illustration of this, but I've got a piece of paper here, and we know the paper is largely two-dimensional. There is a third dimension, but it's very, very thin, but it's largely a two-dimensional plane, if you can think about it in those terms. In order for me to roll up a two-dimensional object, I'm having trouble doing it here in front of the camera. There must be a third dimension in order for it to be rolled up in. So if we have a sky, a heavens, that exists in three spatial dimensions, then there must be at least one fourth, or at least an additional spatial dimension, a fourth spatial dimension. We know the fourth dimension is time, but a fourth spatial dimension in order for it to be rolled up in. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but that's an interesting perspective on this idea of the heavens or the sky being rolled up somehow. So there's got to be that third space. Now, we've kind of laid the foundation here, and we spent a lot of time looking at the Olivet Discourse from Matthew 24. We looked at a somewhat parallel account out of Luke 21, but we also said there were some distinctions. Luke seems to be talking a lot about what happened in AD 70. He also talks about future events, things that are yet in our future, but a lot of what Luke wrote down and recorded about the Olivet Discourse seems to deal with AD 70, when Jerusalem was attacked and they saw it surrounded by the armies, and when he looked at those passages. But then we have this sixth chapter of Revelation with these first six seals. So we see these same parallel accounts in Revelation 6 with the first six seals. Let's just break them down real quick. We have Matthew and Luke both talk about false Christ. This is Jesus, of course, talking, but they're recording it, about false Christ coming. We see that, and we see it in Revelation with the first horse. The rider on the first horse, the white horse, is going forth to conquer. And I think we've identified him as being a false Christ, maybe the false Christ, maybe the Antichrist. In fact, that seems to make a lot of sense to me, and just my meager attempts to understand all of this. We see wars and rumors of wars referred to by both Matthew and Luke, and then we have the second horse, which is the red horse that's bringing war with the sword. We see famines mentioned by Matthew and Luke both, and also, of course, we have the third horse, the black horse, that is has the scales, and we have greatly inflated food prices, which seem to correlate with some type of a famine, food scarcity that's going on at that time. So we have the black horse, and then we also have in the Olivet Discourse death being mentioned on a large scale, and we have the fourth horse, the green horse, the chloros horse, and the only horseman who we know by name, death, is riding on him. Hades is following close behind, the place of the dead. We'll find out more of the significance of that in Revelation 20, but we have the four horsemen paralleling what Jesus told that small group of disciples in that confidential briefing about his second coming on the Olivet Discourse. But then it didn't stop there. It wasn't just those four. We also have a fifth and a sixth seal that we're looking at here, and they tend to deal with martyrs. We had the fifth seal. The martyrs are crying out from underneath the altar, and the martyrs are also mentioned by both Matthew and Luke, as it followed the false Christ, the wars, the famines, and the death. And then the cosmic upheaval, which we see in the sixth seal. So we have a cosmic upheaval referenced by both Matthew and Luke in their accounts, and then we see the sixth seal of all this crazy stuff happening, the sun darkening, the moon turning to blood, the stars falling from the sky, and the heavens being rolled up like a scroll. And look at this. We have six different signs recorded in 3 different places in the exact same order. Now, I'm not the smartest guy around, but in my profession, law enforcement, we might call that a clue, right? There's something going on here, and that's why I believe that Matthew 24, Luke 21 are keys to unlocking the seals that are being broken by the Lamb. Jesus is the one giving them the briefing. Jesus is also the one that's breaking the scrolls of the six, breaking the 6 seals on the scroll. He breaks the 7th one too. We just haven't got to that yet, and we're going to see some interesting things happen. We talked about the martyrs crying out for vengeance. We're also going to see in chapter 8, well, just before the 7 trumpets begin to sound, that there's also a parallel account there about the blood of the martyrs being avenged, and we'll get to that when we get to Revelation chapter 8. So let's move on. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, and they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? We're going to be able to answer that question about who is able to stand when we get to chapter 7, and we'll find out it's 144,000 Jews that are sealed. We'll get to that here in our next chapter. Believers appear to be missing here. Could it be that they've been raptured? just before Christ's return. That has great implications for our understanding of when the rapture occurs. It appears that there might be a correlation there between Jesus' return with his day of the Lord, the day of great wrath, and the rapture of the church just prior to that. So they're protected from that final episode of God's wrath. So the non-believers here, they recognize that the judgment that they're experiencing right now as they're hiding in the caves and all this stuff is falling on them from the sky, that this judgment is from God and from the Lamb. So they're recognizing the Lamb here. That's very interesting. They're making that connection. So we're going to use, of course, this very literal hermeneutical approach to Revelation whenever we can, and that forces us to assume that the book of Revelation is largely in chronological order. I don't think it's completely in chronological order, however, and that is where some of the confusion and some of the challenges come from, is trying to figure out this timeline. But I think largely it's in chronological order. However, there does appear to be some overlapping timelines. In other words, there are periods in the text where we seem to maybe go fast forward to something that hasn't happened yet and is now looking further into the future, and then come back and kind of pick up where we left off, or we're going to go back in time and we're going to do off like a flashback so that we get some piece of information that perhaps is important for us understanding what's going on here at the particular time and events being described. Very much like watching a movie or reading a very well-written novel. If they're written well and they're crafted properly, there's always times during the narrative that you'll either flash back to get some piece of information that's necessary to understand what's going on now, or you'll flash forward. And the really clever writers are the ones that have written these movies or TV shows and books in such a way that sometimes it's hard to tell whether you're going backwards or forwards or in the present for the narrative. And that's one of the challenges here, is trying to figure out where the overlap and these timelines are. I think that right here, as we're seeing the stars fall from heaven and the non-believers are taking refuge in the caves and they're calling for the rocks to follow them and to protect them from the wrath of the Lamb, they're still unrepentant, interestingly enough. I think this is giving us a glimpse forward on the timeline to the time of Jesus' actual return, which we really haven't gotten to yet in the narrative. We're getting this fast-forward view, I think, of something which chronologically occurs later, just before Jesus' return. But hey, I could be wrong. What do I know? I'm trying to figure this out too. So we now have a number of clues that are going to help us begin to build a timeline of events, at least marginally. We know that in Daniel chapter 9, he tells us, or Gabriel tells him, that the 70th week begins when this character that we refer to as the Antichrist confirms a peace treaty, or really more technically, he confirms a covenant with the many, apparently referring to the Jews, because the prophecy is all about Daniel's people and the holy city, which is Jerusalem. So in the middle of that 70th week, those last 7 years, remember it's a week of years, the Antichrist sets up the abomination of desolation, according to Gabriel. And if we're going to understand this literally, that this is actually a future event that hasn't happened yet, because I'm not adopting the preterist view here. I'm adopting a futurist view of our interpretation of Revelation. The abomination of desolation, if he's going to set himself up in the holy place, the most holy place, as other prophecies in the New Testament dictate, then there must be a rebuilt temple. They rebuild the temple. They reinstitute the daily sacrifices. The Antichrist comes in the middle of that 7-year period, and he stops the sacrifices, enters into the most holy place, declares himself to be God. And we'll look at that in great detail when we get to chapter 13. But that seems to be what's taking place here. So in the middle of the week, Jesus said, when you see that event happen, the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, those of you who are in Judea must flee to the hills. That's the warning. And that triggers that final 3.5 years, the last half of those 7 years, Jesus specifically labeled as the Great Tribulation. He did that in the Olivet Discourse. At the end of that period, Jesus returns and sets up his millennial kingdom, his 1,000-year reign on planet Earth that we'll get to in Revelation 20. So let's see if we can chart this out real quickly as we wrap up this rather lengthy study of Revelation chapter 6. We've got these final 7 years. The 70th week of Daniel, from Daniel chapter 9, we know that there is a peace treaty that is confirmed, or a covenant that's confirmed, that kicks this time period off. And we may not know which treaty that is at the time it occurs. We may be looking back to figure it out as other signs and events begin to unfold. I don't know for sure. Nobody does for sure. But there is a treaty that's confirmed. It's not initiated necessarily. I mean, it might be, but the text specifically says confirmed. So it seems like a prior existing treaty that is now being confirmed. Potentially the Abrahamic covenant potentially has something to do with giving the Jews access to the Temple Mount to rebuild the temple. There's all sorts of speculation here, but that's the trigger that starts the clock ticking for that final 7 years. At the end of that period is when Jesus returns. Right smack dab in the middle is the abomination of desolation. Now, Jesus says that after that, there'll be that final 3.5 periods, but we also know from Daniel, all he tells us is that in the middle of the week is when the abomination of desolation shows up. So if we take that literally, that it literally means right smack dab in the middle, and everything else has been pretty literal, including the 173,880 days of the first 69 weeks. So why would it be any less literal when we look at when Gabriel says the middle of the week? But if it's right smack dab in the middle, that means there's 3.5 years. These are 360-day years, so it's not quite the 365 and a quarter days that we deal with in our modern solar calendar. And that means there's 3.5 years afterwards. And Jesus specifically referred to those 3.5 years as the Great Tribulation. And then Jesus returns, puts a stop to it at what's often known as the Battle of Armageddon. It really is the Battle of Jerusalem. Armageddon is where the armies are gathered. We'll get to that when we get to chapter 19. And then the millennial reign lasts for that 1,000 years where Satan is bound in the abyss. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, the unregenerate are resurrected. The second resurrection is the great white throne judgment. We'll get to all that as we continue our study. But this at least gives us a framework of the eschatological timeline that I'm working off of, coming at this study from a classical premillennial view of what's taking place. And so that brings us finally to the end of our study of Revelation chapter 6. We spent a lot of time on the Olivet Discourse here because I think it's key to unlocking these events, these seals, the four horsemen, the fifth seal, the martyrs, the sixth seal, the cosmic upheaval. And now we're going to have a bit of a pause because one of the things that we see as part of the heptadic structure of the book of Revelation is we'll see a series of 6, and then there'll be a pause and a 7th. So we've just seen the series of 6 seals broken. Now there's going to be a bit of a pause before the 7th seal is broken in chapter 8. So join me on the other side for our continuing study as we get into Revelation chapter 7.